Good morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Missy Mathis, and I brought you all here today to talk to you a little bit about newcomer education. The information I'm going to provide to you today stems from my study abroad experience over the summer. I went on a 10-day trip to Amsterdam with a group from UNCW studying newcomer education in the Netherlands. And during our 10-day trip, we had a visit from a group called LOAN, which is a support agency that provides resources and strategies and tips to the newcomer schools in the Netherlands. We took several excursions to museums where I learned more about the World War II. We also went to a place called the Humanity House, which talks about the refugee experience, which was very emotional. And then we, of course, visited a bunch of schools. The IPABO is actually a teacher education training program that does primary education, teacher training for primary grades. We met a nice lady there named Monique who teaches at that school, and she hooked us up with the Islamic Primary School, which was right next door, which is a newcomer school for children who come to Amsterdam. And then on the next day, we went to a school called Oxprong, and only half of us went to that school. Of course, the half that I was a part of. The other half of the group went to a different school. And the two schools that we went to on that second day were both regular schools, but they had newcomer classes held within. And so we went to visit the newcomer classes. And so that was what we did on the first couple days. And then we went to a town called Utrecht, which was a little bit of a train ride away to a school called the ISK. Now, that's the initials, ISK. Stands for a really big, long Dutch word that I couldn't possibly pronounce if I wanted to. But so we'll just call it ISK. And that's actually a newcomer school for secondary school or high school students. And that was actually a really neat experience that we'll talk more about. And then on the last day that we visited schools, we went to a town called Zwolle, which was, again, a train ride away, a little bit of a longer train ride away. And we went to the school that you can see in the picture here called the Landstede. And this was also a secondary education, so high school students. But what was neat about this school is that they also had a lot of vocational education there. So this was a school that did primarily vocational training for high school students who weren't going to go on to university but wanted to learn a trade. So one of the things that we had to do in preparation for our trip was to learn a little bit more about newcomer education and also thinking about what is a refugee. And what we learned from our readings and from our experiences is that a refugee is a person who's fleeing from their country in war-torn regions of the world, possibly, or from some sort of persecution otherwise. So it might be religious persecution or persecution based on sexual orientation or things of that nature. On this slide, you can also see a picture of some of the refugees who we visited with when we went to the secondary school. And some of my classmates that went on the trip with me are interspersed here, but you can see some of the really cool kids that we met when we were at the ISK. So I want us to sort of think about a little bit in terms of the numbers of refugees in the U.S. And as we think about what is a refugee, I want us to also sort of give some thought to how many we think are here in the U.S. and more specifically, how many are in North Carolina. And it might surprise you to know that there are not as many as you might think. So if we think about the numbers in terms of coming to the U.S., according to the most recent report I could find, admits about 84,000 refugees in a year, which is not very many considering our population is 321 million. Now, keep in mind the 84,000 is only refugee immigrants into the U.S. If we take into consideration immigration for other reasons, both documented and undocumented immigrants, the number totals about 43 million. Still, that's a very small proportion of our population, about 13%, but it's an incredibly small number of refugees that are coming to the U.S. And in order to just sort of give you some frame of reference, if you look at the map here, we can see that 2,700 are coming to North Carolina specifically versus the other 49 states in the U.S. And then cross-culturally, if we look at the Netherlands, they're admitting about 45,000 refugees, which is not quite half the number that the U.S. is admitting. But when you look at the overall population, it speaks very strongly about who's taken in more refugees, because the Netherlands only have a total population of about 17 million. And comparing that to the 321 million that the U.S. has, they're taking in a much greater proportion of their population as refugee newcomers. And then the United Kingdom takes in fewer still. The numbers that I found for the United Kingdom is about 18,000 compared to their 65 million population. So in the U.S., we're not taking in very many immigrants, and we're also not taking in very many refugees. But it is important to note that the immigrants that we do have, including the refugees, need to be educated. And so I want us to spend a little bit of time talking about the importance of newcomer education. So when we get students who come to the U.S. from Iraq or Afghanistan or other places, even Mexico or other Hispanic-speaking cultures, we have to keep in mind that they're coming to the U.S. and may or may not speak English. And so learning the new language is probably the number one thing that we have to think about in terms of newcomer education. It's very difficult to plop somebody down in a classroom where everybody's speaking a language that they don't understand. And I can promise you that that's the case, because I just had that happen to me when I was in Amsterdam. We went to visit a lot of schools where, admittedly, a lot of the people in Europe in general, but in Amsterdam specifically, speak English. But in a lot of the classrooms that we were in, the students did not speak very much English, and so the teachers were speaking to them in their native language or in Dutch, and me and some of my colleagues who were there visiting were clueless as to what was being said, and we had to wait for things to be translated for us. And so if you sort of translate that back to the U.S., we've got students in our classrooms who don't speak English, and there is nobody there to translate for them, and so they are as clueless as I ever was without the translation being available to them after the fact even. And so in terms of newcomer education, one of the very first things we have to do is allow the students to learn the new language. And how we do that might differ depending upon the age of the student, which we'll talk about. We also need to think about understanding the culture to allow students who are newcomers to the U.S. to understand what our cultural expectations are in terms of behaviors. We also want to make sure that we prepare them for future schooling requirements. So if we want newcomers to be able to go to college, for example, we have to prepare them for that. If they aren't going to go to college or university, then we want them to be able to develop a career of some sort. And again, knowing the language, knowing the culture can help with that. So there's one school in North Carolina that does a really good job of providing education to newcomers, and this is called the Doris Henderson Newcomer School, which quite frankly is the only school in North Carolina that offers the whole school is dedicated to newcomer education. And you can tell by the welcome sign that I have on the screen for you that straight away they've got welcome written in 12 different languages, so that you can see that they're trying to make everybody from every nationality feel welcome at their school. Outside of this one newcomer school that's available in North Carolina, throughout the rest of the state, we offer ESL classes in some schools for some students. And again, it's not necessarily enough ESL classes or enough English language immersion for students to get a good enough grasp of the language to be able to follow along in a classroom. So if we're talking about young kids in primary school years, putting them in a traditional classroom with some pull-out ESL to help them get caught up to their peers might be sufficient. But if you're talking about middle school students or high school students, they're really old enough and far enough away from that sort of sensitive period of language development that happens in the first few years of life that it's going to be very difficult for them to pick up enough of the language to be successful academically without having some sort of a dedicated newcomers class. And so I think that one of the things that we need to kind of think about is, are we providing the appropriate education for students who are coming to the U.S. without a good grasp of the English language? And one way to think about that, and one thing that I learned through my trip abroad this summer, is to engage in some cross-cultural comparison to help answer that question. Are we doing a good job? So from my quick overview at the beginning of sort of where I visited and the things that I saw when I was in Amsterdam, quickly you'll notice that I was visiting schools in which the whole school was dedicated to newcomer education, or in other situations I was going to schools where there were whole classrooms dedicated to newcomer education. So again, we've got a scenario where we've got students who don't understand the language, but they're in a room where language and culture of the Dutch people is the singular focus. And those separate classrooms and those separate schools really seem to provide newcomer education very effectively. So one of the most meaningful things that I did when I was in Amsterdam, and technically this was actually Utrecht, was when I went to the ESK. We were dealing with secondary age students, so high school students, and I was able to, at one point, go into a classroom where the students were asking me questions in English, and I was able to ask them questions back in English, and it was me and a few of my colleagues. And the reason I said that was the most meaningful is because these are kids who were almost the same age as the students that we teach. And one of the questions that I asked them was, what would you like me to know about your experience as a newcomer that I could then take home and put into good use? And the 4 things on the screen here were the lessons that I was taught by these students. And the first one is, just give newcomers time to settle. When they come into a new school, don't expect them to jump straight into lessons and classwork. Give them some time to settle. Give them some time to acclimate to the school environment. The second thing that we were told is build a connection. Establish rapport with these students, talk to them about things that are hobbies and interests and things they like to do for fun and things that they don't like to do, and tell them about yourselves in some way. And don't jump right in and ask what their story is. And this is especially true of the refugee students, who often have very trauma-filled stories. And they're interesting, to be certain, and we want to learn more about that, but we can't ask that straight away because it makes it seem like that's the only thing we care about. So giving them time to settle, building a connection, building some rapport before we start asking them to tell us about their life. And don't make all of our conversations be about the trauma, because these are kids with normal kid lives who have had trauma, but trauma is not the only thing that they've experienced. And so to focus on sort of a well-rounded look at their life instead of just focusing on the negative things. And then one little boy told us, go soft. And I think that, this is sort of open to interpretation a little bit, but I think that what he may have meant by that was to ease into things and to be gentle and to be understanding of the situation that these kids are going through, and to have some empathy for what they've been through and what they're currently going through in terms of being a stranger in a strange land. And so I think that that quote, go soft, really struck home for me very, very clearly. So in conclusion, I want to open the floor for questions. I've sort of gone through this very quickly because we have a limited amount of time, but I want to give you guys an opportunity to ask me questions about my experiences or what I saw or what I learned, and I'll be happy to answer those. But while you guys are sort of thinking about your question, let me provide for you this list of resources. As I went through my coursework and my experiences, I put together this list of resources for you. So let me pass these out while you guys think of some questions that you might want to ask me. And thank you so much for your attention today.